Hey guys, so a couple days ago I finally got back my JLPT N1 test score results. And so in this video I'm going to be revealing what score I got, talking about a little bit about what my experience was taking the test, and then also giving advice about how I recommend you think about the JLPT if you're studying Japanese. So without further ado, I'll just tell you my score because I know that's what most of you just want to hear. I'll be honest, I did a lot worse than I thought that I did. On the language knowledge and reading sections, I got a perfect score. And on the listening section, I got 69 out of 80. Ugh. If you want to hear my excuse, of course, everything I'm about to say is just an excuse. And so feel free to call it cope and feel free to make fun of me because I know I deserve it because I was way too cocky about this. But basically, it looks like I probably missed about 3 problems here. Because of the way that the questions are weighted, like it's not like you just miss a certain number of points for each question. Missing one question can make you lose way more points than other questions. And basically what happened was I zoned out on one of the questions and totally missed the prompt and then had to make like a blind guess on one of them. And then right after that, I started thinking in my head, like, okay, I know I just missed a question, so now I probably won't get a perfect score. So what's the best score that I can still get if I don't miss any other ones? And then before I knew it, I had missed half of the next prompt. And that next problem was one of the ones where there's like one prompt and then multiple questions for that prompt. And so if you miss the prompt, you miss multiple questions. And then I missed the other one too. So yeah, for me, it's really embarrassing and I'm pretty disappointed in myself. But overall, it's still a very high score overall. And it still counts as like the C1 equivalency. It's basically like within the highest category of passing the test. So with that being said, I kind of want to talk about how I would recommend you think about the JLPT if you're learning Japanese. So the first thing I want to talk about is, should you take the JLPT at all? Well, I think it depends on what level we're talking about. You know, obviously the JLPT has 5 levels. There's N1 through N5. And to be honest, I don't really see any point in taking N5, N4, or N3. Because even if you pass N3, that doesn't signify that you have a level of Japanese ability that you can really use in any professional setting, right? Like that's not going to get you some job you couldn't get otherwise or help you get some visa that you couldn't get otherwise. It's really, as far as I see, just a way that you can, benchmark your own Japanese ability. And so I know a lot of people use the JLPT as just a way to in just that way, right? They use it to benchmark their own Japanese ability. It's a goal that they set for themselves. It's something that they like strive towards, and then they can have a sense of accomplishment when they take the test. And I totally understand that, but I don't think that you should use the JLPT for that reason, but I'm going to explain that a little bit later. When it comes to N2 and N1, I actually do think it's worth taking these precisely because it can unlock certain employment and visa options in Japan. There's this idea that I hear talked about relatively frequently, which is that if you're good enough at Japanese, you can talk your way out of needing a JLPT certificate, right? Like you can go to a job interview in Japan, and if you're just fluent enough at Japanese, they'll be so impressed, they'll be like, oh, I'm going to hire you, or I'll give you the job, and they won't even ask about the JLPT. That's something that I feel like might actually happen in the West, but it's very unlikely to happen in Japan because Japanese people are very strict about doing things by the book, having certifications, having everything look good on paper. And so no matter how good you are at Japanese, even if you're at a level where the JLPT N1 would be very easy for you, a lot of times they're not going to hire you unless you have the certificate because that's just the Japanese way of doing things. And so if you are planning on moving to Japan in the future and working in a Japanese environment or living in Japan for an extended period of time, I think it is a good idea to try to ideally get Japanese or the JLPT N1 just to unlock certain opportunities to you that might be closed off otherwise. And that's actually why I took it myself, because I want to be able to have every possible visa option open to me for the future going forward. So with that being said, like I said, I don't think there's any objective benefit to JLPT and N5, N4, N3. N2 and N1 probably should take. But with that being said, should you study for the JLPT? And I think the answer in the vast majority of cases is no. And that's the most important idea that I really want to get across in this video. And the reason for this is that, like I said, I only really think JLPT N1 is truly what's valuable from an employment standard. And so should you study for the JLPT N1 in that case? Well, I would say no, because when you're talking about what level you need to be at in order to pass the JLPT N1, if you're at the level where you can read the average Japanese nonfiction book fairly comfortably, and you can turn on the average anime and watch it comfortably with no subtitles, or even just the average Japanese YouTube video and understand it with no subtitles without much challenge, then you're going to be able to pass the JLPT N1 without much struggle, even without any particular study. And that's my experience. If you want to get a perfect score, that's much harder, right? That's something I failed to do. I think in that case, you either need to just be smarter than me and a better test taker than me, have even better Japanese ability than me, or practice and actually study for the test, right? Or maybe take it multiple times. So if you really want to get a perfect score, then maybe, yeah, you should actually study for the test. But in reality, there's no reason to try to get a perfect score on the JLPT N1, because when you apply for a job or something, right, they don't look at what your score was. All they look at is, did you pass the test, yes or no? And so on paper, if somebody just barely got over the line to pass and they almost failed, and someone else got a perfect score, when they turn in their job resumes, they look the same on paper. So there's absolutely no reason to get a perfect score on the test unless you just really want the bragging rights, which honestly I think is kind of silly, right? Whereas on the other hand, if you want to pass the test, that's a much lower bar. And like I said, if you just have the ability to function professionally in Japanese, then it's not going to be hard for you. And if the whole reason why I'm saying that it's actually good to have N1 in the first place is so that you can work at a Japanese company, right? Or have opportunities to live in Japan. And so if you're going to work at a Japanese company, you need to have real Japanese ability anyway. If you just somehow game the test and like get really good at test taking because you practice JLPT test taking, but you don't have the true raw ability to back it up, and then you pass, and then you somehow get a job at a Japanese company, that's not actually going to be a good position to be in, right? Because you're not going to have the ability to keep up with what's expected of you, right? So I think that, if you're someone who, as a goal for yourself, you want to get to the point where, yeah, you can watch Japanese content without subtitles comfortably. You can read Japanese newspapers, blogs, books, these types of things comfortably. Then that's your real goal. And you don't need to study for the JLPT. Just achieve that goal you have of becoming proficient in Japanese in general, and then you'll be able to pass the test no problem, like whatsoever. Like, I'm a bad test taker. I always have been, and I still was able to do very well on this test just off my raw Japanese ability. And there's people that have been studying Japanese for a way shorter time period than me and did better than me on the test without actually studying for it at all, just off their raw Japanese ability. So that's basically my argument for why you don't need to study for the test, right? If you just get good at Japanese overall, you'll be able to pass it. I can guarantee you that. You're not going to struggle with it if you have basic Japanese competency. But what about studying for the test just as a way to benchmark your own ability or have a certain path laid out to you to guide your studies? Because I think a lot of people, when they come into learning Japanese, the JLPT becomes like their kind of default curriculum, right? It's like if you're studying Japanese in a university setting, then maybe they give you Genki, or they give you they have a curriculum they use at that university. But if you're self-studying, then that can be a tricky thing, right? It's like, how should I guide my study? There's all these resources out there. Getting fluent in Japanese is such a large, vague goal. It can be really nice to have something like a set of proficiency levels, like the JLPT, where you can just be like, well, I'll study for the N5 and then N4 and N3, and then by the time I get to N1, I'll be fluent in Japanese. I totally get the appeal of that. But in reality, I don't think that's a good way to go about studying Japanese, because if you study for the JLPT test, you'll get good at the test and you'll become able to take it, but that won't necessarily mean that you have true competency, right? There are people who actually have studied their way to the point of they can pass the JLPT N1, but they're not good at Japanese at all. In fact, this is a quite common experience in Japan, is meeting people that have N1 and they can barely hold their own in a basic conversation just about everyday topics, right? There's this other kind of idea that goes around of like, if you're really good at Japanese, it's possible to be good at Japanese but still not be able to pass the test because the JLPT is so hard. And that, honestly, I think is a misnomer. My experience is that if you have a well-rounded set of abilities in Japanese, both in terms of reading and listening, you can converse in Japanese, you can read basic things, the test will not be hard for you. That, I think, is the reality. And honestly, I think some people might be coping really hard when they try to say that the N1 is super hard or something like that, right? At least if we're talking about passing, like I said. So basically what this means is that if you get good at Japanese in general, you'll be able to pass the test. If you study for the test, you'll be able to pass the test, but you won't necessarily build overall Japanese ability. So you might as well take the path that leads to having both, right? I mean, you want the test and the Japanese ability. You don't just want the certificate, right? Because if you don't have the ability to back that up, really, what good is that for you in the long term? And in general, even if you try to take some kind of hybrid approach where you're studying your vocab based on the JLPT, but you also do kind of general immersion and stuff, it's still just going to be less than optimal, because the JLPT curriculum, in my opinion, is just not a very good curriculum. Like, it's not really made by people that have learned Japanese themselves, right? It's made by native speakers that are trying to imagine what will be useful to people that are learning Japanese. It's also centered around business Japanese and being in a Japanese work environment. And like when you're at like the N5 or like N4 type of level, like you're not going to be in a Japanese work environment anyway. So it doesn't matter whether you know those word environment words at that level yet or not. It's going to be a much better way to go about learning Japanese to just find content you actually like, whether that's anime or YouTube videos or streamers or whatever. Learn the language that is comprehensible to you and is actually interesting to you. Build your base of ability that way. And then later, if you need to broaden your vocabulary, learn more words used in the office, then just watch some dramas that take place in the office, right? Or like, read a manga that takes place in a work environment. You can learn all those words a lot more fun and a lot more organically, right? Like generally the list of grammar points and everything that the JLPT has are just not very well put together in my opinion. And generally you just don't need them. That's the thing overall that, I've been saying on my channel forever, is a lot of people, they want some like predefined path to follow when they're learning a language. Like they want a list of vocabulary, a list of grammar points. But the bottom line is you're going to get better faster and have a better time if you just let go of that and you don't use those things, right? Just find content that you like and learn the stuff that comes up. And if you do that, eventually you'll know everything you need to know. By definition, if a word never comes up anywhere except on some list, you don't need to know it. And who knows, maybe you'll need it to get a perfect score on the test. But like I said, you don't need to get a perfect score on the test. And if you just get good at Japanese overall, you'll be able to do plenty fine on the test. I can guarantee you that. And honestly, for me, like I said, I never have studied vocabulary off a list or anything. I just read very widely and learned words that came up in the books. And in terms of vocabulary and knowledge, the hardest section of the hardest level of the test, I got a perfect score on. So again, you don't have to necessarily take it as far as me, but I can tell you that if you just get good at Japanese in general, you'll be able to pass the test. And that's what's going to be the most efficient path to the final goal that you should have, which is getting good at Japanese and being able to pass the test. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. Again, please make fun of me in the comments for getting as bad of a score as I did. But ultimately, don't worry about getting good at the JLPT, just get good at Japanese.